I'm not going to beat around the bush here. I love the BioShock series. At least, that's what my nostalgia has to say. I actually haven't played the series since they each released, but seeing the long-lasting impacts the BioShock series has left on gaming today leads me to believe my nostalgia may be right. When BioShock released in 2007, I can't believe this game is 12 years old, there was nothing like it in gaming. The way BioShock told its story, the big twist, the world, the city of Rapture, and what the city has within, the gunplay mixed with basically superpowers. It's no wonder this game received such universal acclaim, and the game's long-lasting impact on the industry only further cements this game and its legacy. But the question is, how does BioShock hold up today in 2019? To find out, I'll be going through BioShock's story and gameplay in depth. As the title of the video also suggests, I'll be going through the entire series over the next few videos. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, would you kindly consider subscribing? But for now, sit back, relax, and let's talk about BioShock.
I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture.
The year is 1960, as we begin the story in a plane over the Atlantic Ocean. Our protagonist Jack is a passenger on the plane that ends up going down, which we actually hear first before we see what has happened. Jack resurfaces only to find he may be the only survivor, as he heads to a nearby lighthouse. The lighthouse acting as a bathysphere terminal, and upon getting in, we are introduced to Rapture. Through this introduction to the city, we are introduced to its creator, Andrew Ryan, a man who founded this city to escape the prejudices of religion and government. Unfortunately, once we arrive, something has happened within Rapture and see our first splicer in what is a very tense scene. While in the bathysphere, we are contacted by a man named Atlas. Atlas offers to help you survive Rapture, in return asking Jack to stop Andrew Ryan and free his family. Whilst wandering around Rapture, we find our first plasmid, and due to the amount of excruciating pain from altering his genetic code, passes out. When we awaken, we catch a glimpse at a relationship that would become so iconic in gaming, as we get a first look at the big daddies and little sisters. However, a little further along, we do get to see the full extent of this relationship as a splicer attacks a little sister. And, well, I mean, my words aren't going to do it justice. And after all of this, all you can think of is, why did I choose to play this game on hard again, if these things are around? But I'll save that for the gameplay portion of the video. Progressing further, we find a little sister on her lonesome. No big daddy in sight. And it's here we need to decide if we are going to save these girls or be a dick. Atlas proposing we kill the little sisters, and a woman named Tenenbaum pleading for us to save them. And it is a tough decision, somewhat. You get far less Adam for saving the little sisters, but you feel good inside, and killing them garners more Adam, which would have been helpful. But I mean, who can kill these girls? They didn't do anything wrong. Yes, I saved every little sister I came across, a decision that affects the ending you will receive. Just before reaching the bathysphere holding Atlas's family, Ryan destroys it, causing Atlas to become enraged, and kindly asking Jack to head for Ryan and end him, forcing Jack to go through many of Ryan-controlled areas and facing off against many big daddies and variations of splicers. Eventually we reach Ryan's office and confront the man himself. It is here my most memorable twist in gaming occurred. The moment that made me consider storytelling in gaming differently. The moment where not only do we learn that we are Andrew Ryan's son, who was taken away from him and hidden on the surface by a man we've learned about throughout with the audio diaries and backstory called Fontaine, but also that Jack has been an ace in the hole in Fontaine's war against Ryan this whole time. Being Andrew Ryan's son is how we access the bathysphere in the beginning, as it had been locked off for some time. Ryan, knowing his fate, knowing there is nowhere to run, asks Jack to kill him, using the phrase, "Would you kindly?" Unraveling the game's narrative from the very beginning, and now realizing that Jack has been used by Atlas from the beginning, using that same trigger word. Even the note on the present we see briefly on the plane has this trigger phrase, leading us to believe Atlas sent us here from the beginning, and unable to resist, we kill Andrew Ryan with his own golf club. With Ryan out of the picture, Atlas reveals himself to be Fontaine and takes over Rapture and proceeds to try and kill Jack before being saved at the last minute by Tenenbaum and the little sisters we've saved along the journey. From here we need to break the hypnotic connection, such as the trigger phrase and even one that could stop Jack's heart, and after breaking these, go and face Fontaine himself, now godlike from the massive amounts of Adam, and with the help of the little sisters, we defeat Fontaine, and from here you'll get one of two endings depending on your morality. If you harvest more than one little sister, you'll receive the bad ending, in which Tenenbaum narrates the events of the game, berating Jack for his decisions as we see a US Navy submarine come across the plane's wreckage before being surrounded by bathyspheres containing splicers, who attack the crew and take control of the submarine, now armed with nuclear weapons. The good, and what I believe to be the canon ending, I'll get into this more in my BioShock Infinite video of all things, is much nicer. Jack takes the little sisters we saved to the surface and adopts them. They go on to live full lives with him, as we see they remain with him until the very end. And that is the main story of BioShock. Now, for such a highly praised storyline, this is probably the quickest I've gone through a breakdown of a story, and that is because the main storyline is actually pretty straightforward and doesn't progress a whole lot until the last third of the game. What makes the twists and turns of the main story work so well are the audio diaries throughout, giving us a chance to learn more about Rapture and the big players involved in the city's downfall. Learning about Big Daddies, Little Sisters, and those who created them. Learning about Andrew Ryan, Frank Fontaine, and many people who would end up falling within this city. Makes the game's story feel like it is always progressing and always moving forward. You can learn so much more about certain story moments before they have even happened if you keep an eye out for these audio diaries. For instance, Andrew Ryan having a kid that was taken away from him was something I found out through these diaries and learning about the mother of the child. It all just wraps you up in the world and makes you want to find out more about Rapture and its citizens. Even whilst progressing through the city of Rapture and facing the many foes throughout, contain intriguing stories like Steinman, the surgeon pursuing perfection. So much so that upon reaching his surgery, we find many of his victims on the walls, those who Steinman deemed ugly. Even in audio diaries, hearing Steinman talk to his nurse while working on one of these victims, who had gone in for a simple nose job, and proceeded to work her to death.
4-0 silk, and done.
The nose looks terrific, Dr. Steinman. Doctor?
You know, looking at it now, I didn't realize how much her face sags. Scalpel?
Excuse me?
Scalpel.
Doctor, she's not booked for a facelift.
Let's just come in here and...
Or Cohen, the artist who now completes his work with pictures of dead bodies. No one is sane down below. When the creative are left without boundaries, when people are allowed to alter the genetic code with plasmids, a society turns into chaos and leads to a build-up and twist in the main story that makes for a must experience in my opinion. However, the story does contain aspects that I don't dislike, but I would have liked to have been more fleshed out, and that is the big daddy and little sister relationship. Now, through the audio diaries, we do learn a lot about the little sisters and their creation, and I did not find every single diary, but I at least didn't learn as much about the big daddies. I believe this is to maintain their mystery, and we learn about the complexities of their relationship with the little sisters. I just would have liked to have learned a little more about these now iconic foes here. But while I love the story, the gameplay is just as much a core piece as to why this game became the success it is. Now, as I stated previously, I totally wasn't bragging. Yes, I played through the game on hard, so my opinions and my experiences this time around are solely based on how I experienced this playthrough of BioShock. So what do we do while we are in this underwater disaster? Quite a lot actually. Let's start by talking about the weapons, plasmids, and tonics. Basically, the preparation for combat. In terms of weapons, we have some stock standard ones such as a pistol, a machine gun, a shotgun, etc. Whilst also having a grenade launcher, crossbow, and a thrower. What makes these weapons special though is the ammunition types, whether it be anti-personnel, anti-armor, electric, explosive, traps, I could go on. But these help the game's gunplay from going stale, because when you mix in the plasmids, which I'm about to get into, it just gives you more to think about when you're in combat, and that is always a positive in my book. You also have the ability to upgrade your weapons, but you have to find them. And these are not easy to find, which means you need to be smart with your upgrades. And no, you probably won't find them all without a guide. But they are a big help and encourage you to explore the world, which I'm 100% okay with. The plasmids are where BioShock did separate itself from the pack though, and my god are they fun. The amount of plasmids on offer is much greater than the weapons, actually needing to pick and choose which plasmids you carry and when, which unfortunately can have the side effect of plasmids that are never used, like the security plasmid. I mean, I'd rather have something cooler, you know? And we do have much cooler plasmids like electricity, fire, ice, a plasmid to hypnotize big daddies, and my personal favorite, bees. And I'm dead serious. Just seeing enemies swatting at bees, I don't know. We don't see it as much as I'd like.
Oh no, oh my. They're all wilting.
Doesn't look very good, does it?
The plasmids can be used on enemies or the environment, and it pays to take your time before combat to suss out what or where you can inflict the most damage. However, plasmids run on a substance called Eve. Evie? Yeah, I think it's Eve. So you can't just spam your enemies, or you'll find yourself needing to buy or find more, which again adds to more thinking while you're in combat, especially when you start unlocking the upgraded versions of plasmids, and what version of the plasmid you want to use, and how much Eve you're willing to lose. The final stage of preparation are the tonics. Tonics act as upgrades for a variety of different things, and this is where your personal playstyle will come into it. We have ways of improving your hacking, damage resistance, Eve consumption, healing benefits, vending machine discounts. The list seriously goes on. And you unlock so many of these throughout your journey that you will be constantly swapping between them. Again, I don't know how many times I can say this. This all adds to the variety and keeping the core gameplay of BioShock fresh. And like plasmids, you can buy these with your hard-earned Atom, or find them throughout the world keeping the exploration a prominent aspect of the game. A feature, however, that is classified as a weapon, but it rewards you with permanent upgrades, is the camera. The camera is used to research the enemies to learn their weakness and gain damage buffs towards them. And the first couple of times you use this, it's rewarding, and you feel the need to do it. The problem occurs after the first level up of an enemy. The progression of research is such a grind, and it doesn't become second nature at all. I don't want to stop what I'm doing to make sure I get a good photo for little progress. Really my big gripe with the gameplay. The camera just feels unnecessary and a bit too much of a grind. But now that we are prepared, what were we preparing for exactly? Splices mostly, and lots of them. Whether they are melee, gun wielding, grenade throwing, climbing, or teleporting variations, all require you to make sure you have the right weapon and plasmid to put them down as quickly as you can, because usually there will be many you need to take out at any given time. What does make the combat interesting though is what you decide to do with security bots and turrets, usually mixed in while dealing with splicers or in an area that may later continue to have splicers in it. And yes, this brings me to hacking. The pipe minigame, for the most part, is no worries. It's not my favourite, but it's not bad. All you need to do is get liquid from A to B, and for the most part, it is that simple. But sometimes you can get to the very end of the puzzle and either be trapped by broken pipes or run out of the right pieces, leading to a fail and loss of health, which on hard is incredibly infuriating when you're so close to being successful. And yes, I hacked a lot of things, so I had to do this minigame a lot, and it just doesn't have any fun variation to mix things up, unfortunately. But when you successfully hack a security bot or turret, they are a big help in either distracting an enemy or killing them, and it makes for a reward that, despite the lackluster hacking, is worth it. But the big threat, the big test, the big look at me wrong and I make a horrible noise, yes, the big daddies. Yes, by far the biggest test of how good you are at the game are the big daddy fights. They hit hard, will kill you in a few hits, take a lot of bullets, and do make you stress out a little bit, which isn't a bad thing at all. When you need to swap between your ammo types, stun them, change your plasmids and weapons constantly, and it was common, at least for me, to have exhausted all of my resources just to take one of these behemoths down, which makes them feel like a true threat that you bring upon yourself in order to get to the little sister. The big daddies are just roaming around the world, minding their own business, which gives the player the option to fight or leave them be. It really depends on whether you are trying to save or harvest all the little sisters, or how badly you need an upgrade with Adam. There are two separate variations in the big daddies as well, the classic thick boy with a drill, or one with a gun, and both require different approaches. The classic is super aggressive, so stunning as much as possible is essential, and the gun wielding big daddies are super accurate, so cover and distractions are a must for this variety. On hard, however, so I didn't use all my health packs and the enemies maintained whatever health they were on, I did exploit the respawning, so I didn't just use all of my resources all the time. Little cheesy, but they just do so much damage. Unfortunately, however, the big daddies in certain areas are just too many, and once I had more than enough Adam, I did leave them alone, which is a shame considering how much of a challenge they are and how much of a thrill they are to fight. But it became a necessity when my ammo was constantly low with all weapons. As I've said before though, whilst the combat of the game is what most of the journey around Rapture revolves around, actually exploring Rapture is the game's biggest selling point. Finding secrets, upgrade stations, audio diaries, or just a different location to look out at the vast ocean around us made being in the game so damn good, and made it hard to say goodbye when it was all said and done.
What I've come to expect of you. You saved them. You gave them the one thing that was stolen from them. A chance.
BioShock passed the nostalgia test with flying colours if you've made it to this point in the video and you couldn't tell. The game is just hard to fault to this day. For the time, it did something so different in the gaming landscape, and still today, while many games were inspired by the game, nothing quite matches it. The story of Rapture and its conflict, the twist that still today is one of the best in gaming, the combat and variety in combat is refreshing, the Big Daddy and Little Sister stories and relationship is so interesting that all I can fault the game for is that I wanted more of it. While the final boss isn't too difficult, the game on the whole is a great challenge, and the many ways to improve Jack make exploring this beautiful city a must. It only took me roughly 10 hours to get through the game, but it was 10 hours of pure enjoyment. BioShock to this day is a must-play title, and if you haven't played it yet, you need to, and soon, because BioShock is the definition of a game changer. BioShock 2 has always been a game I look back on with the fondest memories. Yes, the original BioShock truly affected and changed the gaming industry, and BioShock 2 is just more of it. But that's okay. Seeing Rapture again was never going to have that same punch. The story was always going to be put under a microscope because of the brilliance of the first game. And I mean, how do you one-up a Big Daddy as an enemy? You can nitpick BioShock 2 until you're blue in the face because of the lack of change from BioShock, but I loved BioShock, and BioShock 2 for me only added further intrigue for this world. At least that's what I remember. Nostalgia can be a funny thing after all, so let's see how it holds up today. In this video, I'll be going over BioShock 2's development, story, gameplay, and the DLC Minerva's Den. I won't be covering the game's previously existing multiplayer for obvious reasons, or the protected trials because, well, I don't really feel like playing it. Let's not beat around the bush here. The first BioShock is one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, and commercially did amazing. The biggest change to development is the studio. 2K Boston, or Irrational Games, produced the original game, but BioShock 2 was developed primarily by 2K Marin, with the help of various other 2K studios. The reason for this change was due to the creator of the original game, Ken Levine, and many of the members of the team at then 2K Boston felt they had said what they wanted to say about the world of Rapture, and wanted to avoid repeating themselves. Several members of 2K Boston though felt differently as they left the studio for 2K Marin to work on a sequel. The game began development in November 2007, starting production with a core team of just 8 people, and added an additional 78 people at the peak of the game's development. BioShock 2's creative director, Jordan Thomas, goes through his first concerns with creating a sequel to BioShock on the BioShock 2 podcast, which, can I say, was a huge help in researching the game's development.
The process began with where do you go with this? How do you bring people back to an experience and terrify them and shock them in a way that they're not expecting, but also fulfill the many expectations that they're projecting onto it.
The idea of leaving Rapture was not an option, as the team felt the city and the world of Rapture is what made BioShock, well, BioShock. But the challenge was making Rapture feel fresh again, not just for returning players, but for the team that worked on the original game as well. The members of the team who moved over to work on BioShock 2 were those who had been in the city of Rapture for thousands of hours, so any idea that sounded new and added mystery back into the world was on the table, and from these ideas they would know how much story is left in the tank in the world of Rapture. From these ideas, 2K Marin knew they could make another game set in Rapture, but to make it feel fresh, the team needed to focus on changes to the environment and how the player would participate in the world this time round. Enter the Big Daddy. The Big Daddies were somewhat of a villain in the original game, and we would save the little sisters from them. So Marin knew they had a wealth of story opportunities if they let us, the player, experience their story and how they would explore and progress through the city. And this single change really got the ball rolling in terms of environments and the game's story. The story did go through some major changes throughout the game's development, with the two most significant changes in regards to the Big Sisters and Subject Delta. At a stage in development, the team were tossing around the idea of having a single Big Sister who would hunt the player down, but was scrapped as it removed the feeling of triumph the player would have after defeating her if they knew she would just return. In terms of Subject Delta though, originally he was intended to be the first Big Daddy, but after some story changes, it was far more interesting for him to be the fourth prototype, but the first Big Daddy to successfully be bonded to a little sister. Just over 2 years into development, BioShock 2 released in February 2010, and critically and commercially did really well yet again, but it wasn't free from many thoughts that it was just more of the same, some fans going as far to call it BioShock DLC or BioShock 1.5. But as I've said, I loved my time with BioShock 2 back in 2010, so how does it hold up 10 years later? The beginning of BioShock 2 takes place in 1958, roughly 1 to 2 years before the events of the first game. We are introduced to Subject Delta as he retrieves his little sister Eleanor and go about their business as usual, before Eleanor is captured, and as we fight off the splicers, end up being hit with a hypnosis plasmid that stops us in our tracks as we are introduced to BioShock 2's main antagonist, Sophia Lamb. Sophia Lamb informs us that our little sister is actually her daughter Eleanor Lamb, and obviously, well, that's a problem. So Sophia forces Subject Delta to remove his helmet, put the pistol up to his head, and pull the trigger, as we see the game resume 10 years later, now after the events of the original game. Delta is revived at a Vita chamber and begins receiving telepathic messages from Eleanor as she is pleading for him to go and save her. And in this game's introduction, we learn that after the events of the first game, with no Ryan or Fontaine, Sophia has taken control of Rapture in their absence. We are reintroduced to Tenenbaum as she explains that Delta must travel across the ruins of Rapture to Fontaine Futuristics, where Eleanor is being held. If we do not reach Eleanor, the bond will stop Delta's heartbeat and eventually kill him, so pretty high stakes. And with the help of Tenenbaum's ally Sinclair, we begin our journey off to reconnect with Eleanor. That really is the main storyline until we reach Eleanor, which means all the additional information we learn from the one-off characters and audio diaries covers a lot of the world building for the game's story. This way of storytelling isn't anything new for the series, as the original BioShock also did the same thing for about 2/3 of the game. So what I'm going to do is continue going over the main story and then talk about the other means the game tells Rapture's story. Okay, so once we reach Fontaine Futuristics, we see Eleanor in her containment chamber. Lamb is there waiting for us, and to stop Delta, she smothers Eleanor to stop her heartbeat for long enough so that Delta and her bond become severed, as Delta awakens captured and slowly dying. Eleanor takes control of a little sister to suit up and transform herself into a big sister, so that she can break Delta out and escape Rapture. Obviously this doesn't go to plan, as Lamb makes a last-ditch effort to stop the duo as she turns Sinclair into a Big Daddy, stating this is what Delta should have been, and forces us to kill him before detonating bombs as Delta and Eleanor head towards the escape pod. The explosion mortally wounds Delta as we ride the pod to the surface. From here, your choices in regards to saving or harvesting the little sisters and hurting or forgiving the characters along the way will affect the game's ending. My ending was the good ending because I'm a good boy and I can't harvest the little sisters ever. So Eleanor saves Sophia from drowning, and Delta reaches the surface and breathes his last breath in Eleanor's arms, leaving the world better off with the little sisters and Eleanor learning from Delta's actions of kindness and forgiveness. The other endings are much more bleak. Now, as I said, that is the main story of BioShock 2, and if you aren't paying attention to the game's audio diaries and the character dialogue or the world itself, you are going to be a little disappointed with BioShock 2's story. There is no big twist or revelation here, but instead what the game's story does well is set up further backstories for the world of Rapture. We learn about what kind of person Sophia Lamb is through the audio diaries, especially in regards to Andrew Ryan's. Learning about the reason she was brought to Rapture, how she used this as a way to begin a cult within the city, becoming a threat to Ryan, ending with her being thrown in jail, and leaving Eleanor with a trusted lieutenant in Grace, who has a truly sad story of her own, and hates Delta for having Eleanor, because Eleanor was in Grace's care when a mole within the cult named Stanley sold Eleanor to Fontaine's orphanage, and is the reason she became a little sister. Lamb's plan of turning Eleanor into an all-knowing superhuman using extreme amounts of Adam, which we see the effects of with Gilbert Alexander, a character that really reminded me of the Fallout New Vegas DLC, Old World Blues, as we see him about the environment as a security drone as his insane current self, but talks to us through monitors he pre-recorded, only to finally reach him and find him to be a hideous monster. Even learning more about the Big Daddy program and seeing the effects of Big Daddies who have lost their little sisters, now insane and forever tormented, or the reason people go through the Big Daddy program to begin with.
Ask yourself, Mr. Meltzer, is it better to be summarily executed as an outsider caught within these grounds, or to be united not just with your daughter Cindy, but with the Rapture family as well? The choice is yours. I urge you to accept the Protector program. You will live by her side and remember nothing beyond your love for her.
I wasn't the first to find Rapture, you crazy bitch. And I won't be the last. You do whatever you want to me. As long as I'm with Cindy, I'm a happy man.
Personally though, nothing blew my mind more than seeing the world from the little sister's perspective. It really is like nothing has happened. The city is still functioning, people are normal, until you begin harvesting Adam, and it shows Rapture's true colours. It only adds to the little sister's feeling of innocence and purity, and knowing that the big sisters are just grown-up little sisters, driven more and more insane as time went on, makes their life feel worth saving. You could say BioShock 2 over-explains or shows too much about the city and world of Rapture, or even that not enough of the story is readily available, leading to people maybe missing some information, but I wouldn't say that. In fact, I still wanted to learn more, and having the information presented through the diaries made exploring the city and its new locales a joy. If I was to nitpick, playing on PC with max FOV can ruin some of the story moments. But that'd be it. BioShock 2's story was something I remembered being interesting, but I could have never anticipated the joy and pleasure I got from learning more about this world and how fresh the feeling would be of exploring Rapture yet again. Now here's the point where I'd usually start talking about the game's, well, gameplay. But this portion of the video may seem a bit shorter than usual because it is an aspect of BioShock 2 that is largely the same as the original game. So to avoid repeating myself, I think it's best to talk about what BioShock 2 improves and changes from the original game's formula. We see a lot of the same plasmids, weapons, enemy types, tonics to change your playstyle, upgrade machines you really have to look for, but what BioShock 2 does in regards to gameplay is just refine these mechanics to make them feel as solid as possible. Such as, instead of swapping between plasmids and weapons, we get to dual wield, allowing us to more easily combo attacks together and speed up the game's combat. No more pipe minigames. Thank God. Instead, we have a reaction-based meter gauge that, if you're good enough, can be used to gain access to more items upon completion. We get to explore the waters outside the city walls this time round, and this acts as a great break in terms of a change to the environment and as a break from gameplay. It's just an aspect of the series that was a logical step forward when playing as a Big Daddy. However, the game's biggest changes are in regards to the Little Sisters. Again, we are fighting Big Daddies to save the Little Sisters, but to gather more Adam, you will need to protect them whilst they gather more from dead bodies, effectively acting as a wave mode of sorts, and these can be tough. With the increase to our attack speed, the logical change is the increase to enemies as well, and whilst this is a mechanic you can avoid, if you want to get the most Adam possible, it is a must and acts as a great source of challenge. But after you save or harvest all the Little Sisters in an area is when the game's true threats are coming with the Big Sisters. Now if you don't save or harvest all the Little Sisters, well, you won't face these guys except for a couple of times, which sort of sucks, but they are no joke. The Big Sisters move incredibly quickly, have access to plasmids, do big damage and can restore health from splices, but you get to choose where you fight them depending on where you drop off the last Little Sister in the area, so it adds a strategy element if you've hacked equipment in an area so you have support, and these are a worthy threat that you will need help with. Really, that's the gameplay loop without me repeating myself from the first video. BioShock 2's gameplay doesn't change a lot from BioShock, it just acts as a way to improve the general flow, and for me, that's enough. If it ain't broke, just tweak it. It's still the same BioShock experience you know and love, just with some improvements. Minerva's Den is BioShock 2's story-based expansion set during the events of the main game, just in yet another section of Rapture. We play as a reactivated Alpha Series Big Daddy, Subject Sigma, as we are heading towards Minerva's Den before we hear a voice over the loudspeaker to detonate the tunnel to stop us from reaching the Thinker. Luckily, we're a Big Daddy, so this just knocks us out for a little bit before we regain consciousness and are contacted by a man called Porter. Porter wants us to reach his supercomputer, the Thinker, to retrieve its blueprints so that he can recreate the computer on the surface. Whilst in Minerva's Den, we hear our antagonist for this story in Porter's former colleague, Reed Wall, who has gone insane from splicing and his obsession with the Thinker. Now again, the main story just has this central plot of reaching the Thinker, and we complete tasks along the way, all in the hopes of reaching the computer. And again, the story is primarily told through the game's environments and audio diaries, but the stories told this time round are absolutely engaging, especially in regards to Porter programming the Thinker. Porter was using the Thinker as a means of having a conversation with his dead wife by using old audio recordings of the two talking to learn more about her, and Porter is someone you truly feel empathetic for because whilst we never meet him in person, he is someone you can feel his pain through these diary entries.
Continuing input of audio data into the Thinker's database. Subject, Pearl Porter.
I want to tell the recorder how we met, Milton.
Okay, sure.
I was working in my family's diner. School was starting for the fall. And one morning, in walks this college boy. Clean cut. First thing I noticed was his eyes. He sat down and ordered bacon, eggs, and coffee. He was shy, but we talked a little off and on. He came in every single morning for breakfast and ordered the same thing. I told my mama, that boy must really love your cooking. She said, he isn't coming in for the food, honey. He's coming in for you. A year later, we were married.
We also learned why Reed wanted to use the Thinker, as he wanted to use the computer to predict anything, as he constantly lets us know that everything we are doing has been predicted by the Thinker already.
How does it feel to know that your grand purpose is foretold by a machine? The numbers know already what will happen. As I tell you this, will it affect the outcome? I am not so much holding my breath.
Once we reach the Thinker, we have our confrontation with Reed and inevitably end him before retrieving the computer's programming code, and it's here the story takes a turn. Sigma is Porter. The Thinker was emulating Porter's voice as a way to guide Porter back to the surface, as Porter had been sent to jail by Andrew Ryan, and whilst in there was enrolled in the Protector program, becoming a Big Daddy. Now, having completed his mission, Porter and Tenenbaum returned to the surface, and in an epilogue, we learn that Tenenbaum had returned Porter to his normal self after administering a cure she had been working on. The story for Minerva's Den is brilliant. Like in the original BioShock story, it throws a twist at you that I didn't see coming until the very end, and it was brilliant. You become suspect of Porter in the beginning as you never see him, but I never expected to be him. The Thinker is such an intriguing plot device, and learning about the two colleagues' different uses for the machine, one for power reasons and the other for personal reasons, was captivating. The highlight is Porter's story with his dead wife. It's a heartbreaking story of processing grief, even having Porter reject it once it successfully recreates his wife's voice.
I believe I'm done feeding audio recordings and personal anecdotes to the Thinker. I am set to test the personality duplication function. Target personality, Pearl Porter. Thinker, are you ready?
Yes, Milton.
Starting test. Hello, Pearl.
Hello, Milton.
How have you been?
Just wonderful, Milton. I've missed you, though. It's been so long.
Pearl, No, this isn't right. It isn't her. Thinker, stop the test.
But what's the matter, Milton?
Oh, God.
Don't you still love me?
Oh, God, Oh, God, I said end function, Thinker. Now!
I could have never anticipated Minerva's Den to be such an enthralling experience, but it may be a personal favourite of mine. I couldn't get enough. In terms of gameplay, again, it basically plays like BioShock 2, with new additions like the laser and the gravity well plasmid, which are great inclusions and change up the gameplay enough to feel different. But the biggest change is the game's progression. This is a 2 to 3 hour long experience, yet we start off with just the drill, and because of this, the pace at which we acquire new weapons, plasmids and upgrades is substantially quicker and honestly a little more engaging. It all just flows really well and was a great conclusion to my BioShock 2 experience. BioShock 2 still holds up today. I think I've made that pretty clear at this point. I honestly don't understand some people's hate or disappointment with this game. Yes, it is more of the same in some regards, but that's okay. BioShock 2 questions and answers so many things about the world of Rapture, playing from the perspective of a Big Daddy only adds more depth into what is now such an iconic character, you feel like a true protector. The game's new locations, audio diaries, exploring the waters, and improvements to gameplay, not to mention an expansion that I recommend everyone go out and play, BioShock 2 just reaffirms for me that BioShock is a series and world that is one of my favorites in gaming. And 10 years later, BioShock 2 is still very much worth playing today. Time is a funny thing. Recently we revisited BioShock 2 for the channel, a game that I believe to be an underappreciated game in this series that on launch was disappointing for many. Yet over time I have felt the tide shifting in popular opinion, and more people at least will admit BioShock 2 is a good game. BioShock Infinite seems to be almost the opposite. Again, BioShock Infinite has always been a game I held in high regard, and at launch many also had this opinion, and I'm sure many still do. They're just less vocal than those who have their problems with the game, whether it be with the game's story, the changes to gameplay, or the early game footage and teasers compared to the game we finally got. And that's really why I love to do videos like this, going back to see if my opinions still stand the test of time, or maybe they don't. I mean, it has been 7 years since the game released and I last played it. So let's see how BioShock Infinite holds up today. In this video, I'll be going over BioShock Infinite's development, story, and gameplay, and seeing how the main game experience holds up today. BioShock Infinite's development returns to Irrational Games, beginning development shortly after the release of the original BioShock back in 2007. The first 6 months of development was focused on prototyping several different ideas to determine the new game's setting, considering going back to Rapture believing that it is synonymous with the BioShock name, but the devs found themselves bored with the idea after working on ideas for stories and quests, which meant the team needed a new setting for this game other than Rapture, which was a terrifying prospect for the team. They had considered a Renaissance setting until Assassin's Creed 2 was announced to be in the same setting and quickly dropped the idea, and it wasn't long after that they arrived at the idea of an air city. The idea of an air city really stood out to Irrational Games immediately, but originally they still felt themselves being stuck in the design of Rapture, and because of this, the game was noticeably darker and too claustrophobic for a city based in the skies. The idea of American exceptionalism didn't come until roughly 6 months before the game was revealed, and this idea and the setting of Columbia came after Levine and the team read Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City. This idea of American exceptionalism and having a city essentially like a traveling World's Fair really opened up the world's design and brightened the color palette, finally allowing Irrational Games to move away from the tried and true design of Rapture. The game's story went through many changes, now having a talking protagonist in Booker DeWitt instead of the previous Jack Ryan and Subject Sigma, who were silent, and this change was primarily because of the story's focus on Elizabeth. Booker needed his own identity and voice so that us the player would not only see Elizabeth as a useful AI companion, but someone we could build a bond with emotionally, and Levine decided to help the relationship of the two characters feel more natural, didn't disclose the full story to Troy Baker and Courtney Draper so they could help develop their characters and refine the story. The story between Booker and Elizabeth drew from many inspirations in everything from books, films, and other games, but two inspirations that stood out to me the most were Beauty and the Beast and Enslaved: Odyssey to the West, which after seeing these as inspirations, I can totally see it in the final product. But in terms of how Elizabeth would interact in this world, Irrational really looked to Alex Vance from Half-Life 2 for inspiration, as Levine described her as a central element and emotional driver for that game and wanted Elizabeth to have a similar role in Infinite. Programming Elizabeth's AI proved Irrational Games' biggest technical challenge though, because they wanted to give her as much human behavior as possible, and this proved to be such a great challenge. Irrational had contemplated removing Elizabeth from the game several times. But Levine countered this challenge by implementing a subgroup within the studio called the Liz Squad that would review all the level designs to help adjust and ensure she was accounted for within the landscape, instead of having her hide away until combat resolved. With the setting of Columbia being a city in the sky, as the early footage for the game shows, originally BioShock Infinite was almost sandbox-like. The setting's inherent verticality, the combat segments were much longer with more AI-driven objectives like calling in Zeppelins, and the game's tears were much grander, going so far as Elizabeth being able to import new weather to combo with the Vigors, BioShock Infinite's version of plasmids. What we ended up with was far more linear however, and whilst I couldn't find a source as to why this change occurred, I can pin it down to two things. One would be the 7th generation consoles struggled with Infinite's ambition. There was no way this would have worked on such ancient hardware at the time. But two, like I mentioned, Elizabeth's AI had its struggles, and the level design needed to be tweaked to help the AI feel the way it was intended. Now look, BioShock Infinite's development is incredibly in depth. You could honestly make a 20-minute long video on the subject, especially in regards to the differences between the game's reveals over time. BioShock Infinite's final product cut and changed a lot of content, such as vigors, tears, weapons, locations, characters, and enemies. So much so that with all the cut content, they could have made 5 or 6 games. Clearly, Irrational Games' ambition was massive for Infinite, and the setting clearly prompted more and more ideas out of the team. And whilst the revealed footage for the game looks incredible, the final product we ended up getting was still widely praised after the game finally released after 5 years of development in March 2013. BioShock Infinite was truly a tale of ambition versus reality. It just so happens that the reality was still incredible. Let me begin by saying this story explanation will involve a lot more play-by-play on my behalf, and I'll go over my thoughts about the story once it's all said and done, because the story here in Infinite is quite complicated in terms of retelling due to the game's ending, which needs to be properly explained and led up to as it deals with the many worlds theory. BioShock Infinite takes place in 1912, where we take control of our protagonist, Booker DeWitt, as he is being taken to a lighthouse by Robert and Rosalind Lutus, as they leave Booker on the island with our only knowledge or objective being, bring us the girl and wipe away the debt. The lighthouse doubles as a rocket silo where we are strapped in and transported to the city in the sky, Columbia. It doesn't take long to realize how polar opposite Columbia is compared to Rapture, as we are baptized just so that we can enter the city. I mean, really it's drowned. The priest gets a little excited.
I don't know, brothers and sisters, but this one doesn't look clean to me.
Whilst unconscious, we get a flashback to a moment we will learn more and more about as the game progresses, but for right now we learn about Booker's gambling debts that resulted in him needing to go to Columbia. Once Booker regains consciousness, we explore Columbia unnoticed until we get to the infamous raffle scene, where we become identified by a policeman due to the brand on our hand, AD. A sign of the false shepherd. The man bearing this brand was prophesied to lead the lamb, aka Elizabeth, the girl we've come for, astray and lead to the downfall of the city by Columbia's leader and prophet, Father Comstock, leaving Booker now a wanted man needing to fight his way to Monument Island, where Elizabeth is being held. Once we reach the island, we learn about Elizabeth's abilities of manipulating tears, rips in the space-time continuum that lead to parallel worlds. We manage to free Elizabeth as her warden, the Songbird, attempts to stop us by destroying the tower as Booker and Elizabeth narrowly escape, if you call plummeting to the unknown a successful escape. We manage to survive the fall as Elizabeth pulls us from the water as Booker repeats the name Anna. From here the pair head towards an airship as they plan to head to Paris, a city Elizabeth is obsessed with, always wanting to see it for herself. To get there though, we end up passing through the Hall of Heroes, where we learn more about both Booker and Elizabeth. Booker was involved in the Battle for Wounded Knee, a massacre on the Native Americans and a piece of the puzzle towards his gambling debt due to guilt. We also learned that Elizabeth is Elizabeth Comstock, daughter to the Prophet. Not a massive shock to us the player, but to Elizabeth fills her with rage. Once we reach the airship, Booker changes plans and heads for New York so he can deliver Elizabeth to Robert and Rosalind, which Elizabeth doesn't like as she knocks Booker out and flees. We awaken to find the airship is now under the control of Daisy Fitzroy, the leader of the Vox Populi. The Vox, as they are referred to, are a rebellion organization made up of the oppressed groups within Columbia, looking to take over. Fitzroy offers to give Booker the airship back if he supplies enough guns to arm the Vox before again, we take a pretty big fall that you wouldn't immediately just get up from. After some more chasing and convincing, we yet again join forces with Elizabeth to secure the weapons for the Vox from a local gunsmith. And this is where Elizabeth's ability to manipulate tears comes into full force, as to retrieve the guns, she needs to layer tears on top of tears, manipulating reality in the hopes of getting the guns to the Vox, as the gunsmith was found to be dead in our present reality. The compiled tears mess with our present reality though, disturbing Elizabeth due to the physiological and psychological consequences of the world, from characters or enemies who have died in our reality, but through the tears rise back up as a husk of their former selves. Becoming desperate, we head through one more tear in the hopes of getting the guns to the Vox, but this tear leads to a world where Booker is dead and has become a martyr for the Vox Populi, as we see the Vox in the process of their revolt. This universe's Fitzroy doesn't believe Booker is her Booker, and says his being here undermines her Booker's sacrifice and threatens to weaken the Vox's cause, and turns the Vox against us, which leads to Elizabeth being forced to kill Fitzroy. As Booker and Elizabeth get back to the airship, Songbird attacks again, crashing them back to the city. Booker and Elizabeth won't be able to leave Columbia without stopping the Songbird, so instead seek the instrument that can control it. This is where the founding of Columbia starts to become unraveled. After attempting to get inside of Comstock's house, Elizabeth is used to create a spectre of Lady Comstock, which we follow and learn quite a lot. Okay, so first off, Robert and Rosalind are in fact not twins, but the same person from two different realities. Comstock and Rosalind had actually taken Elizabeth from his alternate self in Robert's universe, and as such make Elizabeth Comstock's adopted daughter. Comstock did this because he could not have a child and was artificially aged with the use of tears to obtain his prophecies, and needed a future leader for the city. However, there was a little stick in Comstock and Rosalind's plan, that being Lady Comstock, who believes they had a child together and is furious. To stop the truth from getting out, Comstock plots the murder of the Lutesses and Lady Comstock in order to hide Elizabeth's origins, and used it as a way to blame Daisy Fitzroy for the murder of Lady Comstock. Comstock, though, didn't manage to kill Rosalind and Robert, as he inadvertently spread them throughout the multiverse, giving them the same powers as Elizabeth, and is the reason they appear and disappear throughout the story. Back to Booker and Elizabeth though. Once we find a way inside Comstock's house, the Songbird finds them, and in a plea to save Booker, Elizabeth allows the Songbird to capture her, but as Booker tries to follow them, ends up being transported into the year 1984 by an elderly Elizabeth. This older Elizabeth warns Booker that with the Songbird around, he won't be able to save her, and reveals the devastation of what that means to the surface world in the future. To prevent this, she hands Booker information on controlling the Songbird, in hopes that he will be able to save her younger self and spare her the years of torture and brainwashing in this future. Booker returns to 1912 and rescues Elizabeth as we finally meet Comstock face to face. Comstock demands Booker explain Elizabeth's past to her, as he apparently knows why she is missing a finger, but he doesn't remember, and in a rage kills Comstock. Booker decides to destroy the Siphon, a device that suppresses Elizabeth's abilities so she can access her full power and learn the truth. We gain control of the Songbird and order him to destroy the Siphon, but the device that controls him also becomes destroyed. And as Songbird goes in to attack, Elizabeth opens a tear, transporting all of them to the city of Rapture. But only Elizabeth and Booker are within the city walls, and Songbird dies from the immense pressure of the ocean. Elizabeth takes Booker to this reality surface lighthouse and travel through the building's door to a place outside space and time, where there are countless numbers of lighthouses, all containing alternate versions of them. Elizabeth explains they are within one of an infinite number of possible realities, both similar and drastically different due to choices that have been made within that reality. Elizabeth shows Booker the truth in 1893, the setting for all the game's flashbacks, and it is here all is revealed. Robert Lutece approached Booker on behalf of Comstock, requesting that he give us the girl and wipe away the debt, which actually referred to Booker's infant daughter, Anna DeWitt, which is why he branded himself with the mark AD, because he reluctantly agrees to sell Anna to clear his gambling debts, only to shortly change his mind, arriving too late to stop Comstock from escaping through the tear and closing on Anna's finger, leading to Comstock raising Anna as Elizabeth and revealing that Elizabeth, or Anna, is Booker's daughter. The reason Elizabeth can create tears is because she exists in two realities at once, with her finger and the rest of her in separate realities. Robert, however, is the reason Booker began this mission of finding Elizabeth, feeling guilt for his actions, and with Rosalind's help, bring Booker to Columbia in Rosalind's reality to rescue Elizabeth. Now, whilst Booker had killed Comstock in one reality, he is not gone from all universes, and to stop this cycle and prevent Comstock from being created in the first place, Elizabeth transports Booker to the place where he went to be baptized and cleansed of his sins after the Battle of Wounded Knee. Booker avoided this baptism in Robert's reality and went on to have Anna, but in Rosalind's reality, Booker went through with the baptism, found religion, and became Comstock. To stop this cycle, Booker agrees to let the alternate versions of Elizabeth drown him and stop Comstock once and for all, allowing him to never exist as the alternate versions of Elizabeth fade away one by one. But the screen cuts to black before the original one does, and in the post-credit scene, A. Booker awakens back in 1893, hearing a baby in the next room, and calls out for Anna before opening the door to her room, and again cutting to black. That's the story for BioShock Infinite, at least from the way I interpreted it. Now, the end of the story really does dump a lot of information on you, so much so that it can almost feel overwhelming and hard to process initially. But in fairness, it is mainly in regards to the game's multiverse that can feel hard to follow. In regards to Elizabeth being Booker's daughter and Booker being Comstock in another reality, the game set it all up very well, and can be theories you have that are confirmed earlier than the big reveal. But let's back off the ending and talk about the rest of the game's story, because it has a lot of positives, but also some personal complaints. In terms of positives, where do I begin? Booker is a great character to experience the story through his eyes, as we learn more about his life prior to the game's events, and before we reach Elizabeth, we do get to see and experience the world of Columbia, which in the beginning is still a fully functioning city, unlike what we experience in Rapture. However, whilst clearly Booker is integral to the plot and overall mission of escaping Columbia, and Troy Baker does a great job at voicing him, really the story here follows Elizabeth. As much as Columbia is new to Booker, not only is it equally new to Elizabeth, but the world itself is a foreign concept. Not only does the story follow Elizabeth's experiences and joys of being free, finally interacting with the world, finding joys in the simple things like dancing or roaming around an arcade, and as the story progresses, not only does Booker and subsequently us the player learn more about Elizabeth, but she also learns this same information. Because of this, we see the evolution in Elizabeth's perception of the world she thought she knew adjust into the world we are actually in. And this moment is truly evident and realized when Elizabeth is forced to take the life of Daisy Fitzroy. Before this, while she was disturbed by the results of altering this reality and seeing the results, taking the life of Fitzroy really forces her to come to grips with not only having no great cause for the city, but the world she had read about and seen through her tears is much darker than she was led to believe. Courtney Draper did a great job at portraying the character of Elizabeth, and the chemistry between her and Troy was believable. A mainstay in the BioShock series storytelling is through audio, and whilst these are still a form of storytelling here in Infinite, having some great nuggets of information to primarily supporting characters or antagonists, a lot of information about the world or story we are experiencing is done in-game through Booker and Elizabeth. This change really helps the story feel continual, like something is happening throughout compared to BioShock 1 and 2, where you have a main task at hand, and really for most of the game, the extra story and development of characters is through the diaries until the story picks up towards the end. I'm not knocking this form of storytelling, because I loved it in those games. If you've seen my videos, you'll know that. But here in Infinite, it makes the overarching story of trying to flee Columbia feel like something is always occurring, or more about this world is ready to be learned and revealed. The world of Columbia is a character in itself, much like Rapture, but this time we experience the city's fall into chaos. We see how the city was intended to function as people lived their lives. We caused the city to plummet into chaos, and seeing this change was really an appreciated change of pace. It's clear a lot of Infinite is almost polar opposites to Rapture, from the main villains to the city's location, but the location of Columbia is just as rich and interesting as Rapture. I was especially fascinated by the American theme of the city, showing presidents as godlike people, the city worshipping Washington and poo-pooing Lincoln, whereas the Vox are opposing and worship Lincoln, and for the time period it all makes sense. Look, obviously I'm not an American, so there is probably a lot of details I personally missed in this setting, but I knew enough to appreciate the ideas. Where I have an issue with the story is namely with two characters, the Songbird and Daisy Fitzroy. Right off the bat, I'm going to acknowledge these two characters' stories were probably a result of some cut content, and I do know both of these characters do get expanded on in the game's DLC to somewhat fix this issue, but in terms of the main game, they are a letdown. First off, Songbird is such a big threat, or at least appears to be, yet we don't encounter him all that often, and it doesn't even lead to a boss fight at the end. He just appears to halt the player from leaving, and really doesn't do much else. We don't learn what he is or why he watches over Elizabeth, and he just ends up being a bit of a letdown. Daisy Fitzroy, on the other hand, feels rather rushed. She gets more build-up and character development through the voxophone entries, but she is used in the actual story rather poorly due to the overlapping multiverses, turning her into a villain too quickly and being killed off shortly after. She had so much potential, as we learned she was used as a scapegoat for Comstock murdering his wife, yet she just isn't developed or in the story enough to really care that she ended up dying. Really, that's it though in terms of complaints with the game's story. In terms of plot holes, there was no glaring issues that I could see, which is quite a feat considering the game's subject matter. What BioShock Infinite's story does really well is develop intrigue in the world of Columbia with a great setting and backstories to be told, build a connection between Booker and Elizabeth, and continually add and expand upon the story to a point where the plot twists are hard to see coming until they arrive. I was hooked in from start to finish from the story alone. There is no lull in the story to speak of, but we are talking about a game here. So how does BioShock Infinite's gameplay hold up today? BioShock Infinite's gameplay seems to be where the complaints for the game are focused. But I'll be honest, I think BioShock Infinite is an absolute blast to play, but I do understand the complaints. BioShock Infinite does make some changes to the BioShock formula in a shift more towards the first-person shooting rather than the previous entries' blend between FPS and RPG elements, but overall is quite similar in terms of the series' mainstay mechanics. The gunplay really does feel like the main aspect of BioShock Infinite's gameplay, which makes sense in regards to Booker's character as he is an ex-soldier. Let me get this out of the way. Yes, I would have preferred a full arsenal in comparison to the 2-weapon limit, purely because with this method it does mean a lot of the time one of your 2 weapons will be an explosive weapon of some sort to handle the Patriots and Handymen. So really you only get to choose one gun. And this is a shame because there is some weapons that very quickly lose all of their value in terms of you picking them up. To counteract this though, on hard, whilst not overly difficult, does involve you running out of ammo more often. So if you do want to survive an encounter, you will need to be more desperate with your weapon choices. This desperation at times does mean you need to prepare for a bad situation in advance, making sure you are stocked up with ammo, upgrading every weapon at least once on the off chance you'll need to use it, and that feeling does make the negative of not having a full arsenal and somewhat turns it into a positive. Whilst on the weapons, they feel like they pack a real punch, from a headshot blowing off an enemy's head or blowing away an enemy, and the weapons feel responsive and great to use. But it wouldn't be a BioShock without some sort of superpower like abilities, and much like plasmids, whilst Vigors have a good amount of variety, like the Electrobolt in the previous games, you will stick to just 1 or 2 Vigors throughout, and here it's Bucking Bronco. It's just too useful to launch enemies into the air and pick them off one by one. But at least the Vigors look badass, even if story-wise they don't really get an explanation as to why they exist in this world. Now, a big thing for my personal enjoyment of the gameplay here in Infinite does rely on the game's difficulty. Even on hard, the game is quite easy, but on normal and below, it's just a joke, especially if you play the game through the BioShock collection or have the season pass, because this is what the beginning of the game looks like. All of this DLC gives you upgrades for health, shields or salts, tons of money and clothing items which replace the tonics of the original games, and these items will last you for the most part until the end of the game, and you get all of this basically in the beginning. It makes the game a bit too easy on top of a game that is relatively easy to begin with. the game's enemy variety is where the game does improve for the most part over the previous entries, as we have similar variations in the standard enemies on top of Patriots, fire-wielding enemies, crow people, and handymen. And once the game starts throwing all of these enemy types at you at once, it really does make you go into that desperation mode I was talking about earlier, which makes the game feel more challenging, and for me, that makes it more fun. The enemies aren't flawless though. The crow people are a little too easy and don't even throw crows at you, so they just become a bit of a pushover, especially with bucking Bronco. But the handymen are the biggest letdown. The closest comparison to a Big Daddy in Infinite are the handymen, which had a ton of potential in terms of story.
Samuel always thought that the pew on Sunday went hand in hand with the desk on Monday. Science is the slow revelation of God's blueprint. After 2 years in the Lamb's Tower on Monument, he took ill with cancer of the stomach. I prayed to the prophet, and the prophet delivered unto us a miracle through his servant Fink. I do not know if I will ever get used to a husband bound in a skeleton of metal, but better a handyman than a dead one.
But from a gameplay perspective, they are just too few. I think you fight them a total of twice, maybe 3 times. And whilst they introduce a true threat to gameplay, especially in regards to halting your usage of sky rails and constantly being in your face with little Vigors can do to help, again, we just don't see them enough. But BioShock Infinite's gameplay isn't all combat, and often will have breaks of just experiencing the world alongside Elizabeth. Going for side missions to unlock secret goodies, in the beginning seeing Elizabeth experience the outside world for the first time, and getting to see the world from a new perspective. Learning about Columbia's backstory through voxophone entries or the environment itself, even when you are transported into the future, it really isn't a combat stage and more stealth based, because the enemies that catch a glimpse of you call in the loonies who are tough to kill, ignoring the fact that they have massive trumpet ears yet are deaf and use sight to catch you. Someone forgot to redesign this character. All of these breaks in the combat make you really invest in the story of BioShock Infinite and build that connection with Elizabeth, which is why I think I enjoyed the story so much here. Like the previous entries, the game's downtime was where I truly became invested in the world of Columbia and wanted to learn more and more. Again, I couldn't get enough. Look, BioShock Infinite's gameplay can be hit and miss. It's not perfect, but what I will say is I thoroughly enjoyed my time playing through it. No, it's not the most challenging game. There are definitely some missed opportunities from weapons to enemies, but when it was all said and done, I really did look back on my time with the game and just think, that was a blast. And really, what more can I ask for? BioShock Infinite may not be the game it had the potential of being. All of the game's cut content from the development could have only improved the game as a whole, but the game we ended up getting was thoroughly engaging, intriguing, and a great time. The story is constantly giving you more information to try and put this puzzle together to form the greater picture. The gameplay does fiddle with the formula of this series, but for the most part, it works. A statement I see a lot with Infinite is, it isn't a BioShock game. It strays too far from what made those games great. And my response to that is, what makes a game BioShock? And I'm actually asking because I don't know what I would consider to make a game BioShock or not. And I want to know your thoughts on that question. Is BioShock Infinite a good BioShock game? I think so. But what I can say with full confidence is, I had a great time replaying through BioShock Infinite. And yes, in my opinion, 7 years later, it still very much holds up today. Here we are. The final part for my series of retrospectives covering the BioShock games, as we conclude this series with BioShock Infinite's 2-part DLC, Burial at Sea. Now, what is different about Burial at Sea compared to the rest of the entries in the series is that I actually only played this DLC a year or two ago, and because of this, my classic test of nostalgia is much lesser with this one. I adored Burial at Sea, primarily because of the story, just due to the gameplay feeling like DLC, smaller and more condensed. But the story adds to both the original BioShock and BioShock Infinite's universe, and it just feels good to be back in the city of Rapture. But the question is, how does Burial at Sea hold up today? Today I'll be going over the story and gameplay of both episodes and see how the BioShock series would end up concluding for now. Burial at Sea takes place yet again in the city of Rapture on the 31st of December 1958, a date we've seen already in the beginning of BioShock 2, but from a different perspective. We again take on the role of Booker DeWitt, this time a private investigator in Rapture. As we are approached by a mysterious woman we quickly find out is Elizabeth. I have mysterious woman in air quotes because I don't know if my brightness was too high or what, but it is portrayed as though she is supposed to have some sort of reveal, but I clearly can see her as soon as she comes through the door. Elizabeth asks Booker to investigate the disappearance of a young girl named Sally. Booker believes Sally to be dead or worse, a little sister, but Elizabeth insists she is alive, and says Sander Cohen may have the information we are looking for as to her whereabouts. As we leave Booker's office is when Rapture gets its grand reveal. Not broken down or chaotic, as we have seen previously, but bright and bustling, finally seeing the city of Rapture for what it is intended to be. This reveal is really quite fitting for BioShock Infinite's DLC, because we saw how Columbia functioned as a city from the beginning, and then saw it progressively fall into chaos. But we have only briefly seen how Rapture used to function, and this intro of exploring a fully functioning Rapture was beautiful. We got to see the practical uses for plasmids, the big daddies at work repairing the city, the little sister's beginnings, and not only does this city inside the walls of Rapture feel more alive, but the waters outside also have more life to them. After exploring around Rapture and finding an invitation to Cohen's party and see what Cohen is working on with his performance art, which doesn't end well for the performers,
Fitzpatrick! Please! That's... Save him for God's sake! My views shall not be mocked!
and Cohen makes Elizabeth and Booker replace them in return for giving us information about Sally, whilst also warning Booker about Elizabeth's intentions. Cohen, displeased with Booker and Elizabeth's performance, shocks them both unconscious, but does keep his end of the bargain and drags them to a bathysphere as he claims it will take them to Sally. Once we awaken, we realize the bathysphere is heading away from the city and down to the sea floor, where Ryan had just sunk Fontaine's department store, and Cohen reveals that Sally is in the housewares building, and it's here on the sea floor that Rapture becomes much more of a familiar sight, as the department store and Fontaine's men have all fallen into chaos. Not much more story happens until we reach housewares though, when we find Sally moving around through the vents, and after closing off all the exits, Elizabeth says the only way to flush her out is by turning up the heat. This somewhat works and reveals Booker's fear was true, and Sally has been transformed into a little sister. In shock, Booker still tries to drag her out of the vent as she calls for a big daddy, but after taking care of him is when the episode's twist occurs. Whilst trying to drag Sally out of the vent, memories start to flood back to Booker, where it reveals not only is this Booker a very regretful Comstock who worked with the Lutessas to take Booker's child Anna, but in that universe, not the same as Infinite's. Instead of losing a finger in the struggle, this struggle ended up decapitating Anna/Elizabeth. As Booker, now revealed to be Comstock, comes to, he remembers the Lutesses used the tear device to move him to Rapture, so that he could forget and move far away from his troubles. Comstock passionately apologizes to Elizabeth, but to no avail.
But you're about to be.
The Big Daddy, not actually dead, ends up impaling Comstock with his drill, and the final scene of the episode leaves Comstock looking over at a merciless Elizabeth covered in his blood. Episode 2 begins on a much happier note than episode 1 left us with. Elizabeth is finally in Paris. It is bright, everyone is saying hello. Everyone is saying hello.
Bonjour, mademoiselle. Bonjour, Elisabeth. Bien le bonjour. Bonjour, mon ami. Bonne journée. Bonne journée. Bonjour. Bonjour.
Yeah, this is a dream quickly realized upon finding Sally, as the atmosphere takes a sudden turn into a nightmare, feeling guilt for burning Sally all to get to Comstock. This was a great introduction. The happy Disney movie like Paris quickly falling into darkness, following Sally into the furnace only to turn around and find her standing behind you. Not only does it have a visual pop, it's actually quite creepy, but it shows Elizabeth's immediate guilt for pursuing revenge, a theme that this episode runs with. After the nightmare, Elizabeth awakens to Sally being taken away by Atlas and his men, but before they can shoot Elizabeth, she has a vision of Booker, who coaches her into saying the right things to keep her alive, namely being, she can help them escape this prison and return to the city, only in return though, for Sally. Atlas agrees to the terms and leaves Elizabeth, which after some exploring, she finds her own dead body in the rubble. Elizabeth realizes her former self was killed by the same Big Daddy that killed Comstock. The reason we are another Elizabeth in the same location as we were left off is because Elizabeth's powers allowed her to continue to exist in another multiverse, but her sense of guilt for using Sally to seek revenge on Comstock moved her to go back to Rapture and clean up the mess she left. The Lutesses advised Elizabeth not to return to Rapture, as she would lose her ability to open tears because she would be cut off from the alternate universe's Elizabeths and would be much more vulnerable in this state. But she ignored this advice to save Sally. Suchong is the key to escaping this prison, as we finally track down his lab to not only learn that he knows about Columbia, but he had also built a Lutece device connecting back to the floating city. This is the key to raising the prison back to Rapture, as by going back to Columbia, Elizabeth can use the Lutece particle that kept Columbia afloat on the department store. We head through the tear and back to Columbia to get the Lutece particle, simple enough, but Suchong won't allow us to return until we get a lock of hair from Fink's laboratories. On our way to Fink's labs, we learn why Daisy Fitzroy went through such a drastic change in Infinite, as we find out the Lutesses instructed Fitzroy to take Fink's son hostage, promising that with her death, the city would fall. I will admit this moment can be seen as damage control to a certain degree for the criticisms of Infinite's plot holes, but I still appreciated this moment, and it is a great showing as to how much Fitzroy wanted her revolution to matter, whether she got to see it or not.
Your part in the play.
Or the play itself.
Turn her into a killer? How?
Give the girl no choice.
And she will be forced to make one.
Elizabeth also learns that Fink and Suchong have been communicating through the Tear Rift on many projects like plasmids and vigors, but also the creation of both Songbird and the Big Daddy's technology, because Fink had linked the Songbird to Elizabeth, and Suchong is yet to successfully bond the Big Daddies and Little Sisters, hence why we needed a lock of Elizabeth's hair. Once we collect a hair sample, we return back to Rapture, and after giving Suchong the hair sample, we make it to the top of the department store to use the Lutece particle and see the building begin to rise. It doesn't take long for Atlas's men to capture her, believing her to be more valuable than she led on. Atlas proceeds to torture Elizabeth, asking where the ace in the hole is, with threats of lobotomizing her and the use of truth serum, but she remains silent until the threats change towards Sally, and in a panic, Elizabeth recalls a future she witnessed and tells Atlas that the ace in the hole is in Suchong's lab. Atlas again holds Sally hostage until she holds up her end of the bargain of finding the ace, and we head to Suchong's lab and find the coded message, the ace. After returning to Atlas, we decode the message for him, would you kindly, which Atlas realizes is the trigger phrase Suchong implanted within Jack. Now having no use for Elizabeth, Atlas delivers a fatal strike to her head and leaves her alone with Sally. In her final moments, we have a final vision of the end of BioShock with the saved little sisters, a future she came to Rapture to ensure would happen, and the game ends with Elizabeth smiling at Sally as she dies. And that's the main story for Burial at Sea episode 1 and 2. There is a lot of story to digest in just a 4-hour experience, and this was the reason I wanted to ensure this was a separate video, because I loved experiencing this story. Whilst episode 1 is a more gameplay focused episode, it still has a lot of intrigue in the story. Why does Elizabeth want to help this girl? What is her motive is a question asked very early on. But the twist is brutal. Again, Booker is Comstock, we've seen that before. But this reality's Comstock being filled with such guilt from killing Elizabeth and forcing him to go to another reality, memories wiped to live out his days, was great. And seeing Elizabeth being so cold and merciless seeing him die was a great way to end the first episode. Exploring a functional Rapture, learning more about the beginnings of the little sisters and big daddies around the world through the new videos, a feature brought in from Infinite. But the story really does go to another level with episode 2. The previously on isn't even about refreshing you on episode 1, but the original BioShock, so you knew from the beginning this was going to really try and conclude the series. The thick atmosphere in the beginning showing Elizabeth's guilt in regards to Sally and the reason she returned after the Elizabeth we were with in episode 1 is found to be dead. My favourite aspect of this episode that doesn't really impact the main story but was a really great insight into Elizabeth is her still talking things through with Booker, who acts as her subconscious. Booker is used to great effect in this episode because it allows Elizabeth to show a wide range of emotions, but easily my favorite is this moment of pure panic and fear.
Please. I don't know what to do, Booker. Booker? Booker! No, please. Please just don't leave me here! Booker!
Elizabeth talks to Booker as if he isn't her subconscious, and you really do understand just how alone she truly feels. It was one of my personal highlights of the story. I also love seeing Suchong and Fink's collaborations, especially in regards to the Big Daddies. Whilst I enjoyed having an explanation for Vigors, more information about Songbird, and the construction of the Handymen, seeing the Big Daddy and the little sister bond being created was the best of the game's backstories. The Big Daddies and little sisters are yet to realize how important they are to one another, which we see when a Big Daddy is gravely injured and the little sisters are cowering, and only with the help of Elizabeth do we see the connection become realized. We get to see some audio diaries come to life from previous games, explore pre-war Rapture, more of Columbia, and back to the Rapture we are all familiar with. Burial at Sea's story does a great job at linking the two worlds of Columbia and Rapture, and for the last BioShock experience for now, it does a great job at feeling like the series has come full circle. And if for nothing else, the story alone is why this DLC is worth playing. The gameplay is where this experience becomes much more straightforward to talk about, especially in regards to Episode 1. In Episode 1, the gameplay is a mix between BioShock and BioShock Infinite. Some weapons are changed from Infinite, we get a new plasmid, but the real change is to the money and ammo. You have little of both for most of the game, and it does feel like Irrational Games addressing the criticism of Infinite that it was too easy, because whilst not overly challenging still, it is more so, just because you seemingly are always struggling to have a fully stocked weapon. Other than that though, I'd feel like I was repeating myself in terms of gameplay for Episode 1. It feels like a mix of mechanics in the series. Episode 2 on the other hand does change the formula a little more with Elizabeth. Elizabeth isn't Booker, or Jack Ryan, or Subject Delta. She isn't great with guns, and while she can pick up and use some guns, it quickly makes you regret that decision. Episode 2, because of this, is somewhat of a stealth game. Is it the best stealth game I've played? No, but it is still a lot of fun and looks to borrow a lot from Dishonored and Thief. Both series I absolutely adore. You will be crouched a lot of the game, looking at the floor, making sure you aren't making too much noise. But if you do this, it isn't overly difficult to avoid being detected, especially when you take into account the new plasmid, Peeping Tom, aka invisibility or seeing through walls. In terms of weapons, Elizabeth's go-to is the crossbow, with 3 different bolts being the tranquilizer, noisemaker, and gas. Basically the standard, but most of the time you will just be using the tranquilizer, and this will take out most enemies with a single shot, and that's the same with melee attacks in stealth. Whilst if the enemy knows you are there, the melee is useless, but in stealth you can again take out most enemies in just a single hit. That is the standard gameplay loop, and I acknowledge it isn't the most fully fledged experience, or the most challenging in regards to Episode 2. I don't really know how to explain it. I just had fun playing the game. The gameplay on the whole isn't the most fleshed out, but I still found a lot of enjoyment to be had here. BioShock Infinite's DLC, Burial at Sea, is an experience you could break down, analyze, and easily find some problems with. I don't do that personally, and I can acknowledge that the experience isn't without flaws. However, on the whole, I loved my time with Burial at Sea. It adds a lot to both BioShock and BioShock Infinite. It expands more on the many worlds theory, and the beginning of the descent to Rapture we know and love. Whilst the gameplay isn't why I would personally want to replay this experience, the story certainly is. The twist at the end of Episode 1 is merciless and grim, and leads us into Elizabeth's perspective, seeing her fears and struggles with trying to ensure the right events that she isn't even quite sure of are falling into place. I love this experience, and I can honestly say if you weren't the biggest fan of Infinite and never played Burial at Sea, go and play it. It ties together the series and leaves us with a concluded BioShock series for now. Alright, now to the part of the video that seems to be the big ticket item in these videos. We've revisited and reviewed each entry in the BioShock series, and now it's time to rank them. Before we get started, I do have to do my obligatory spiel. First of all, being that obviously this is all just my opinion. Just remember, I'm not you. And as always, I urge you to leave your own opinion down in the comments. Everyone's different and going to place these games in different spots depending on your own experiences with the series. Secondly, and most importantly, I have to acknowledge the fact that I think all 3 games are great. I say this because inevitably, one game has to be last and another has to be first, and I don't want it to come across like I dislike whatever is at the bottom of this list. I really do love the entire series and would happily replay all of them again, which, given it's been about 3 years since I finished covering the series, it might just be time to do that. I will also say that I'll be ranking just the 3 games, so DLCs like Minerva's Den and Burial at Sea will be a part of their respective games and not ranked individually. With all that being said, let's get into this, shall we? Starting at number 3, we have BioShock Infinite. I think this one is sort of expected, right? I mean, out of the 3 games, it does sort of feel like the odd one out, but not just because we're away from Rapture. I think Infinite's biggest killer is once again when you see what the game could have been versus what we actually got. So much promise, so much potential, so many great ideas. They just weren't achievable for that generation of gaming and ended up hampering some aspects of this game. Now, with that being said, I still think the final product was great. I loved being introduced to Columbia as a fully functional city, and through the course of the game witness its downfall. Booker and Elizabeth are the perfect characters to experience this story with. The story is captivating, and whilst I'm sure you could point out the plot holes to me, it doesn't feel too glaring, which for a story centered around infinite universes is impressive. I love the 2 Burial at Sea DLCs as they try and tie all the universes together, and especially in episode 2 do a lot of story amendments and mix up the gameplay in some unique ways, which was great to experience. I still really enjoy the gameplay loop overall, despite changing quite a few things that in retrospect I'm not a big fan of, such as not having a complete weapon wheel and instead going to the standard 2 weapon limit, and Vigors, at least in the main game, don't feel like they had any real world uses, leaving the player to question why they'd have some of these abilities at all. For me though, the reason BioShock Infinite is at the bottom of this list is simply due to the fact that because of that ambitious development, a lot of content had to be cut from the main game, which resulted in storylines like Daisy and Songbird not getting the attention they desperately needed, and in a series where every game is great, it's those sorts of issues that do knock you down the pecking order. Now, as much as I enjoy BioShock Infinite, it will always be below the others in my mind. That won't change day to day. Trying to decide between BioShock 1 and 2 as to which is my favourite very well could. I love them both, and you could make an argument for either being better than the other. But as of right now, for me, at number 2, we have the original BioShock. I know. How could you rank the original behind the sequel? The introduction to the world of Rapture alone is something I will simply never forget. It's one of my favorites, if not my favorite gaming intro of all time. Rapture is such a special world to explore. The characters are sick and twisted, introducing the world to the likes of the Big Daddies and Little Sisters. The backstory is so captivating, and the story itself is so well executed. I've played this game who knows how many times at this point because of how incredible Rapture is to be a part of, how interesting this place is to fight in and explore. Really, the only good reason I have for putting it below BioShock 2 is I personally prefer the gameplay loop of the sequel. Not to say I don't like the gameplay on offer here, because it's still a lot of fun, but again, it's the little things like swapping between your plasmids and your weapons, and the pipe hacking minigame that are aspects I think the sequel did improve upon. Overall though, the original BioShock is still a game I will never forget experiencing, and it is truly something special that any given day could easily be my number 1 pick for the series. But of course, at number 1, I have BioShock 2. Now you can say this story isn't as good as the original. You can say Rapture doesn't have the same impact the second time around. But as someone who loved the original, I didn't need BioShock 2 to reinvent the wheel. All I needed was a reason to come back to Rapture. And that's exactly what I got here. We get so many more answers to long-lasting questions. We got to experience the world of Rapture through the eyes of a Big Daddy. We get to dual-wield our weapons and plasmids, increasing the pace of combat. The hacking minigame was much improved and provided more rewards for quicker reflexes. We got to explore the outside world. We got a new enemy type that rivals the Big Daddies with the Big Sisters. And to top it all off, we got one of my favorite DLCs of all time in Minerva's Den, which is such a compelling tale and truly one of the best stories in the series. But the big question you need to answer in regards to BioShock 2 is Rapture as interesting this time around? For me, it really is, but for some, It isn't, and that's a big reason you either love this game or you see it as nothing more than a glorified expansion. As someone who loves BioShock 2 though, the biggest reason it's at number 1 for me is because I would happily go back and revisit this game today, and I feel I would come away with even more to love about it. And with all that being said, that's it for the BioShock series. For now at least. Thank you all so much for watching the video if you stuck it through to the end. BioShock is one of my favourite series of all time, and I can't believe it's already been so long since I finished covering this incredible series. If you did enjoy the video, make sure to leave it a like because it helps let me know that you enjoyed yourself. Comment below your own personal rankings, I'm interested to hear what you think. Shout out to the channel members Infamous Sir Hellfire featuring Gagiano, Christian Vilgag, Cloud Connection, Cynical D and Conker for that extra level of support. I truly do appreciate it. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, go give my socials a follow if you fancy, at MayorHairBear, and I'll catch you all in the next video.